Okay, I think we'll get started then. Again, thank you very much. I just want to welcome you to this panel, Rethinking Robert Lepage, the Next Decade of Lepage Studies. And I just want to acknowledge that we have the wonderful support of the Marilyn I. Walker School of Fine and Performing Arts and the Faculty of Humanities at Brock University. My name is Peter Dickinson. I'm coming to you from Vancouver, Simon Fraser University. I want to mention off this top, as you probably have noticed, we are recording today. And I want to turn it over to one of our panelists, Melissa Pohl, to start us off with a land acknowledgement. Melissa?
Thank you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the stolen Indigenous land that I occupy and welcoming other panelists to do so via the chat. I'm a settler Canadian zooming in from my part-time home in Kansas, which is historically home to many Indigenous nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee. Kansas is the current home to the Iowa, the Kickapoo, the Prairie Band Potawatomi, and the Sac and Fox. Many nations, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal efforts to make way for white settlers. This territory was, and still is, stolen land. I'd also like to acknowledge that Zoom has erected its headquarters in San Jose, California, which is the traditional territory of the Muwekma Ohlone tribal nation. Dr. Jill Carter has graciously provided us with the acknowledgement of this nation that will appear in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And I invite everyone, if they wish, to put their own land acknowledgement in the chat. So I just want to start by introducing the panel briefly. We're 40 years into the career of Robert Lepage. He remains Quebec's and Canada's best known and most talked about theater director, but his impact has been hard to pin down, in part because he works across so many media. The upcoming publications and recent publications of the esteemed panelists here with us today try to address this gap by placing Lepage's work in larger currents and histories of performing arts practices, exploring his legacy, influence, and his responsibility. We will be addressing the 2018 controversies. So we have lots of questions that we want to address, including Lepage's devising and design-led dramaturgy, theoretical approaches that can be applied to Lepage. As I mentioned, how he works across theater, film, opera, circus, design, installation, and all of those other media. But we're going to dive right in, and I want to do so by first introducing our panelists. I'm going to begin in alphabetical order with Dr. Christie Carson, a Shakespearean performance scholar, who is the author of the forthcoming monograph, Robert Lepage's Intercultural Encounters, part of Cambridge University's Press's Elements in Shakespeare Performance series. Dr. Karen Fricker, Associate Professor in the Department of Dramatic Arts at Brock University and the theater critic for the Toronto Star, has just published Robert Lepage's original stage productions, Making Theatre Global, out with Manchester University Press's Theatre Theory Practice Performance series. I should know that because I have a book in that series. Melissa Pohl, a postdoctoral fellow with us here at Simon Fraser University, but zooming from Manhattan, Kansas, as you heard earlier. She is the author of Robert Lepage's scenographic dramaturgy, The Aesthetic Signature at Work, published in 2018 by Palgrave as part of their adaptation in theater and performance series. And Dr. James Reynolds, Jim, is a freelance writer based in London and the author of Robert Lepage Ex Machina Revolutions in Theatrical Space, published in 2018 as part of Methuen Drama's Engage series about key practitioners, movements and genres in theater and performance. Russ has put into the chat that we invite you to drop your questions into the Q&A box as we're proceeding. We're going to leave 20 minutes for questions at the end, and Russ is going to alert us to pertinent comments and questions as we go along. So panelists, let's dive right in. And my first question to you is has to do with, I read out specifically the series, the press series that all of your works are published in, because I think they speak quite significantly to the ways in which, the multiple ways in which Lepage's varied oeuvre can be addressed through adaptation and scenography, through theory and practice, by placing him in the context of Shakespeare adaptations. Jim, in your book, you give us a useful overview of all the sort of contexts right at the start. And Karen, you address sort of the different critical approaches to Lepage also in your introduction. So my first question to all of you is kind of to put you on the spot. 40 years into his output, who is your Robert Lepage? If you had to claim him as being one thing, auteur, provocateur, adapter, Shakespearean interlocutor, all of the above, Quebecois versus global drama theater maker, who would it be? Maybe your book is so recent, Karen, I'm going to start by putting you on the spot.
Hey, thanks, Peter. I'm so glad I invited you. Seriously, thank you so much, Peter, and everyone for being here. Yeah, Peter did let us know this question in advance, and I've been pondering it. And so thinking about who I mean, Robert Lepage belongs to no one. He's his own man. But I think the Robert Lepage, what I want to say is to me, he's an artist who struggles. And I think he's been that since the first time I encountered his work, which was 30 years ago, I think this month, at the National Theatre of Great Britain, where I saw the production Tectonic Plates, which I know Christie has a particular vantage on. And I was fascinated by him as an actor, as someone who was one of the creators of this piece and already the famous auteur behind it, but yet a collaborator on it, someone who plays so many roles, and someone who's become an incredibly important and powerful and responsible figure in Quebecois and Canadian and global theater. But where I want to come from is thinking about him always as an artist who has worked his whole career to create structures in which he can continue to be independent, which is a deeply paradoxical position or statement. But I think the struggling to continue to be able to do things in the way that he wants to do them as he matures, as his responsibilities grow, that's really one of the narratives through my book. And we have found, you've already mentioned 2018, Peter, that questions of responsibility, authorial responsibility to cultures other than his own are huge. And I see an artist there struggling in 2018, at least, with those questions. So that's a long-winded answer. He's an artist who struggles.
Great. I'm just going to go in the order of my boxes. Melissa, I've got you next.
Okay. Well, when I met Lepage in my 20s, I didn't meet him, I saw him on stage. He was this magical, wonderful, mythical unicorn who did theater that I'd never seen anything like before. It just blew my mind. And he stayed that way in my mind till about, I'd say 2011. In 2009, I saw Lip Sync with my partner. And after the first scene, we looked at each other and we both had like tears just streaming down our faces. And that's a lot of the sort of wonderment that Karen talks about in her book, how the affective potential of Lepage. But when I started watching him work on The Ring and I saw his Wendake Tempest, I started having questions about his interculturalism. And for example, there was use of brown face in Siegfried. There was also, in the Wendake Tempest, although it was on Huron-Wendat land and a collaboration, there were no Indigenous designers. So that sparked my interest in the interculturalism. And I'm going to be really honest here. When the things happened in 2018, I canceled Robert Lepage. Luckily, I had my postdoc at SFU to keep me going. So for me right now, he's a very contentious figure. He's extremely problematic. Looking back to prepare for this, his work is amazing, but I'm still struggling with if I can forgive and move forward with what has happened.
Okay. Great, thank you. Christie.
Hi, I think my journey with Lepage is probably the longest. It was 35 years ago that I first encountered him, and it was Vinci in Montreal at the Musée des Beaux-Arts. And again, it was one of those things that just sort of, as you say, Melissa, blew my mind and made me, you know, it was the inspiration for my PhD. It was like no theater I'd ever seen before. And then I pursued, you know, I looked at, my PhD was on intercultural theater specifically, and looking at tectonic plates as an example of the way that he worked with the actors in Scotland, where I was doing the PhD. And I've always had problems with his intercultural work. And so I cited that at the time. And then actually once the PhD was done, I was a little done. And so I moved on and worked on Shakespeare and performance for many years, where I met Karen at Royal Holloway. And we actually had probably the world's concentration of Shakespeare scholars for a while there, when Sasha Dunjerovich was with us as well. And so I tried to get away from Lepage, but he kept coming back at me. So first of all, you know, he was constantly at the National Theatre, so I'd go and see him. But then increasingly, he came into the Shakespeare and performance world. And most recently, and most ironically for me in a strange way, his collaboration with the Stratford Festival and Coriolanus has sort of made everything come full circle for me, because, you know, in a sense, they're the most text-based and he's the least text-based approach coming together. But and that was going on at exactly the same time that these other productions were happening that were getting all the flack for their cultural insensitivity. So in a strange way, I feel like it's taken a very long time for other people to see the Lepage that I have seen right from the beginning almost. But I still see, in 2018 also, I think it was, that I was in Romania at the Craiova International Shakespeare Festival, and they had brought Needles and Opium. And again, for people who hadn't seen it, it was a transformational experience. Whereas I also went to see the Seven Streams of the River Ota, you know, the 24 years after it was first at the National. And I have to say there were certainly people in the audience going, hasn't really moved on, has he? Mm-hmm. So there's this interesting way in which I have gone from being a super fan, I guess, in some respects, to being a little bit critical, to being quite critical, to being coming to terms with it in a strange way. And so I'm actually wanting to look at the way that his intervention, I suppose, is what you were talking about, into the Shakespeare and performance world has had a real impact, you know, in a way that many other artists haven't.
Great, thank you. Jim?
Yeah, this is probably the most difficult question of the evening, you know, because you've got, you know, like Melissa said, someone who's a bit of a unicorn, really hard to sort of pin down. So I'm going to fudge my answer a little bit. I apologize. I'm going to say that I see Robert Lepage as existing on a continuum. At one end of that continuum is the fantastic energy of a 4-year-old playing with a set of blocks in a sand pit and just making a universe, with taking complete ownership without any fear, just absolutely just unbridled creativity. And at the other end of that continuum, you have someone who is given a budget for $165 million to completely remodel a Las Vegas casino in its architecture and build the most expensive and the most complex stage machinery the world has ever seen. And in the middle of that, you have all of these critical problems which come up from that absolute playfulness. That playfulness, when it's applied to areas of culture, you know, it sets things on fire, because wow, you know, you're playing with this thing. So there's the limits of play, but then on the other side of that, there's, in terms of the theatre art itself, which, you know, isn't, in my opinion, in a great condition, you have the reviving capacity of this commitment to experimenting with the raw building blocks of theatre, space and architecture. Can you have that radical revitalizing force without these car crashes like 2018? Can you not? I don't know, but I think this is one of the difficulties with Robert, is that he's sort of everywhere and nowhere. He has this energy. He can really make things happen that probably no one else can. But that energy can, you know, sometimes not really be controlled, and things can go wrong.
Great, thank you all. I did want to start you off with the toughest question of them all. And I just will follow up on that. It seems to me that so much of like who Lepage is for us starts with that first encounter. And interestingly for me, it was film. So I remember him as Pontius Pilate in Jésus de Montréal, for example. And then, you know, my criticism on Lepage is primarily concentrated on his film output. And then I want to get to this, the idea of how you receive him according to where you are. So I've seen most of his theatrical productions when they come through Vancouver. So Lepage in Quebec and on the international or rest of Canada stage is an interesting question. But I'd like to, so we'll get to that, but I think Jim has actually nicely led to the next question I wanted to ask him, thinking about Lepage as a maker. So Karen had asked us to consider the question of where he fits into narratives of direction and devising and design-led dramaturgy. And I'd like to combine that with another question in terms of considering that approach to making across his varied output, thinking about how that has changed from the start of his career to where he is now, and what does going back to that early work offer as a lens on his recent productions. So I don't really have, I invite anybody who wants to jump in to answer that question to do so.
I'll go. Thank you, Peter. And thanks everyone for their answers so far. It's already super exciting and interesting to be sharing points of view. In thinking about where he fits, where Lepage fits in narratives of making, what I'm finding so interesting about this moment of like finally publishing my book and seeing, feeling like I'm in dialogue with those of you who are also very recently publishing about him, is that we can actually historicize him already and talk about how that mode of making in the 80s and 90s, I would say, there was something about the way that the way that he was making theater that struck us all as extremely fresh and at that point felt unique. Of course, he didn't come from nowhere. He came from a tradition of devising and collective creation in Quebec, and he's also part of a tradition of theater making that is very much, that has been written about and historicized in UK theater studies as well. I'm thinking about Duška Radosavljević's book, Theater Making, which is exactly about communal making and tensions around collectives working together, and then what about the star director, and where does authorship fit into that? And so I think that he's absolutely part of a trend or a moment in theater, an international trend in theater making in the 80s and 90s that was about devising. I think perhaps the design-led element of it might be a particular contribution of his. But I guess my question now, I believe, and I argue in my book, that kind of making, certainly when it comes to group work, ran its course. It's not really working like it used to anymore. And we see that in the fact that Lepage's more recent group productions that are made in that same style just simply have not been as well received and have not toured as extensively as the others. So that leads us to the present day and to be asking, well, what, and I think this is something that Jim really addresses in his book, is what is Ex Machina doing right now in terms of different kinds of making across genres? So I guess a mode of collaborative creation that was part of a larger movement that made a massive contribution and has since ran its course. I'm kind of bracketing the solo shows. I'm not necessarily talking about that, but I'm talking about group making. So I'm wondering what people think about that.
Sorry, I was just going to say that one of the things that struck me when I went to the National Theatres and the Seven Streams of the River Oto most recently, and heard him speak, you know, just before the first lockdown, was the fact that in the auditorium, you know, we had his very cinematic vision, and then outside in the foyer there was the design prize. I can't remember the name of it. Can you help me out, Jim? It's but
Linwood?
every day they have it. Sorry,
Linwood.
that's it. I think that's what it's called, or Linbury. Anyway, it's something like that, and they had all of these amazing models in the foyer, which were all sculptural, you know. And that's what I thought was really interesting, is that the picture frame, the cinematic picture frame, looked really sort of stilted by comparison to these incredible, pieces of sculpture that were going to be, you know, I mean, they were just models, but they were going to be lit from different sides, and it was all projection. And there was certainly no, what they, used to call in Shakespeare world, the fancy dress. You know, it was all very symbolic and transformative. And so the sort of transformations that Lepage made, a name for himself with, didn't seem to be as dramatic as these new visions that young people were coming up with. So I guess I'm agreeing with you that it was tremendously exciting at the time, and then things have kind of moved on, and I feel like he sort of stayed in one position, and yet the response to him has, changed dramatically as a result.
Well, I would like to add, just in terms of the question, how he's returning to the works from the beginning of his career. It seems to me that with Seven Streams and the Dragons trilogy, his solution to, or his attempted solution to some of the problematic representational politics has been casting authentically. So not having Quebecois, white Quebecois people play Asian characters. But I haven't seen either Seven Streams or the Dragons trilogy, but what I get the sense, everything I've read, is that much more hasn't been explored. I feel like his feeling might be, well, okay, if I just cast it authentically, that fixes this. But then there are other things like Needles and Opium, where I think that has probably been the most successful of the shows to come back. And he talks about that he realized that he couldn't, they represented Miles Davis with an actor in shadow. Is that right, Karen, originally? Yeah. And so he talks about the fact that he knew that he couldn't do that he actually had to have this embodied by a Black performer. And the Miles Davis character just grew and blossomed, and he had this amazing kinetic text. So it's, to me, there's a real inconsistency in returning to those works. Orientalism seems to be the real sticking issue.
Well, and I would say to that, well, first of all, the Seven Streams of the River Oto did not depict any period beyond 1999, which I thought was interesting.
Okay.
Not dealing with the 21st century, essentially, it seems to me a little bit. And, the Needles and Opium, the Miles Davis character still remains silent, which again, I think, is a bit of an issue.
They've definitely got a, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, you go ahead, Jim.
No, I think the Needles and Opium has another reboot in it, with a proper, and it would take it in a very different direction. I've got 2 points. One is responding to the sort of the thing about the, receiving Lepage's work for the first time. And then I think I might have to be reminded, but, by the time I've spoken, what Melissa was saying, but first of all, it's that thing of, if you go and see your first Robert Lepage show now-ish, it will likely have the same effect on somebody who had their first show like 20, 30, 40 years ago, whenever it was. Because if it's the first time you're encountering that sort of formal vocabulary, that way of telling stories, it can still seem remarkably fresh, because really people tell, stories pretty much in the same kinds of way. So what I've done is over the years, as I've become accustomed to it, I've always gone to see the shows twice, and I've always made sure I go with someone the first time who's never been to a Lepage show. And every single time, people are just blown away, and they're like, God, I never knew theatre could be so good. And then I'll go with someone else who, you know, who's seen Lepage, and they'll say, well, he's doing the same thing. And I think that's the thing, is it is a remarkably fresh form of theatre when you first encounter it. But particularly the longer shows, I think, are harder to sustain the evolution of them. And whereas I think the solo shows have evolved their vocabulary, and I actually think his solo work is in some ways getting better because it's coming closer to his voice as an artist. I think there are different dynamics at work, and in some ways maybe the attention, you know, the energy we put on the larger shows maybe could go into other stuff. And then I think what Melissa, what you were saying about the sort of the and Christie and what everyone really the intercultural problem. Yeah, I mean maybe we'll, but yeah, I haven't got a. Well, I'll just stop there because we're going to talk about that a lot, aren't we?
Yeah. I have just a follow on from what folks have been talking about is the questions about restaging the Seven Streams of the River Ota without really working on it other than casting differently. I mean, that is the case because if you look at the credits of the version that was touring, I mean, it was running at the National in London when lockdown happened. The authors are listed as the authors of the 1990s version. So they are restaging an existing text and existing staging. And this to me goes to questions of where is Ex Machina and where Lepage's Industries right now. And I think the reason why Le Diamant in Quebec City, a new art center, was built was in part to be a stage for the repertoire. So they're trying to create repertoire. But then we're asking questions about like, well, if you put on a work like Seven Streams that was very well received originally, but also had some questions asked about Orientalism, and you don't, if you will, fix that 25 years later, is this work going to stand up as repertoire?
Can I just add, sorry, Peter, we're hijacking. Just on Christie's point, this is something I've thought a lot about Wellesley Robertson III being silent as Miles Davis. This plays in for me to a lot of the ways we read theater. And I think as Westerners, we put text, spoken text, logocentric text is like the high point. And I don't necessarily think that his embodied text, it was lesser than the speaking characters. I know there's the issue of, you know, is he silenced? But I just found there was something really powerful about Miles Davis speaking through his music and his movement. So those hierarchies, I mean, watching Lepage, they have really shifted for me, especially with Shakespeare, you know, the spoken text versus the performance text and what it can do. But I completely appreciate your point, Christie.
Well, it's a difficult one because, yes, you know, if you were trying to fix everything, you know, that goes away from, I mean, I hate to say it, but he does remind me of Shakespeare in the infuriating way in which, you know, he constantly makes things that have all sorts of problems with them. And then you get people coming along trying to fix the problems and they take away the magic, you know, or the, you know, whatever it is that's unusual. And again, so I similarly think, you know, the Dragons trilogy, wouldn't it be great to actually have a show at the moment that looks at, you know, the history of the Chinese community in Canada, but it would be a very different show than the Dragons trilogy. That I don't think you can make that into the show that, you know, that community might want. But I think the other thing that really struck me about the Seven Streams was that it was, and again, I can't remember the word, it wasn't in celebration, but it was in honor of the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And again, you kind of think, what are we celebrating here? And why are we choosing Lepage to do this? And he's again talking about the people visiting from far away, but it was a, you know, a Japanese, at least partially Japanese, commission from that point of view. So one of the points that he made when I challenged him in 1992 on interculturalism about the Dragons trilogy was the fact that, you know, the Chinese community weren't upset that there were French Canadian people doing the roles and not pronouncing the Chinese properly. They actually, you know, they were just delighted that somebody was interested, quite frankly. And so there is a, you know, a very different, I mean, again, it's very easy to impose our cultural expectations on others. And I think, you know, as you were saying, Jim, he just blows all of that out of the water. He doesn't, you know, notice or care, I think, until the response comes later. But it is iterative. And so you'd think that it would be helpful if he made more substantial revisions in response to those.
Can I jump in there?
Sure.
Yes,
I think that's the thing is, you know, there are things that you can fix, like spot fix, you know, like we need to change this role. But what the ground that has shifted is the ground whereby, you know, white Western artists put themselves in the position of, you know, constructing work that is essentially going to speak for someone else's experience. And it's that thing, is that whole underlying gesture has been revealed in the last, I mean, it was always, you know, problematic, but there's now a consensus that it's increasingly unacceptable. And, you know, one of the debates that happened at a conference was, you know, well, okay, so you live in an all-white country. Let's just have this as an abstract. But you want to put a play on in which there is a black character. You know, what do? Do you not put on the play? Or do you put someone in makeup? And it's just that thing of, you know, he is going back to this stuff, and Karen's absolutely right. It is about repertoire, and very often, you know, it fits in terms of their production schedule, in terms of keeping a slate of projects circulating the globe. And if they haven't got time to make a new original work, they will they will bring this back. So, you know, this is what happened with the Dragons trilogy when they revived it. It fitted. It was, well, we need to do this because we there's a hole to fill. So there is a sort of question of economics about it, but at the same time, it's what you could propose to the company is you actually need to completely rethink what you're doing when you look at culture. You know, you are making a theatre that is not just, you know, it's not just biographical, it's not historical. It really gets its, you know, these are the building blocks. This is the playing. I'm going to play with these things. And that can be really productive. But where we are now is, you know, in a moment of much more complicated consciousness about what we do as artists. Because I just think people have come to it's just not, you just can't do it now.
But no, you can't. But I think the other thing that I, you know, tried to draw people's attention to at the time was that, you know, when it was performed in Canada, the Dragons trilogy was quite clearly a metaphor for what, you know, the people in Quebec were feeling. So the fact that there were, you know, people from Quebec playing those parts, you know, was all part of that. But once it came to tour the world, then it was seen as representative of what actually took place in Canada. And that's where I found myself getting very confused and conflicted, because like you say, people were wondering and admiring the show, but it had all these underlying issues, and lack of context, it seemed to me, that people didn't really understand where it was coming from. And, you know, my piece that I've written is that Lepage was very quickly picked up as the new Peter Brook in Europe. And that just, you know, took him in a completely different direction in terms of the criticism and the expectations of his work, which didn't really have anything to do at all with his own environment and his own way of approaching things. But it was, you know, oh, here's another, you know, famous, well-known auteur who does English and French approaches to Shakespeare. And so at least within the critical world that I was, you know, spending time, I constantly wanted to say, but you don't understand. That's not what he's trying to do. So I saw there was a lot of misunderstandings of his work as well.
So maybe I'll just jump in there because I think it's a good place to actually talk about Lepage as Quebecois artist and Lepage as the international theater maker. And so Jim asked this question in our pre-discussions about to what extent is he identified with Quebec, even more so. Does that explain to a certain extent some of what happened in 2018? Or as well, my problems even with 887 and the Speak White and the erasure of Indigenous politics in that issue. Or is it that he continues to be the global Remy Charest connecting flights theater maker? And I think that, Christie, you've already alluded to the fact it's not an either or, it's a both and, depending on where he's received. So maybe I'll just invite some discussion about that, and maybe we can think about it in terms of reception, and that will lead me subsequently into asking about Lepage criticism. But we'll just start with Quebec, the rest of the world, and I guess because in terms of Jane Coustis's work on Lepage in Toronto, and that the way she reads him as crucially being receptive as a kind of gateway to the rest of Canada through Luminato and other places. And I know that you're familiar with that text quite well, Melissa, so you have some takes on that too. Anyway, that's a lot, but take it and run.
Well, I wanted to say this made me think of The Ring immediately, and speaking about how people identify Lepage and what they think of him. Peter Gelb, the artistic director of the Metropolitan Opera, had to run a huge counteroffensive before The Ring opened, saying this isn't going to be some Euro trash Ring. And I found that really interesting. I guess Lepage, reads as this European auteur. And I just find that really interesting. What is a Eurotrash ring? I mean, Patrice Chéreau did a brilliant ring in 1976 that inspired Lepage. I do want to say, though, about Quebec, when we were at the Metropolitan Opera, they had a Quebec flag backstage, which I thought was really interesting. And also, I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but in collaborations with bigger companies, French language was used as a way to sort of work in a smaller group to sort of exclude the larger group at the Metropolitan Opera. Sometimes there was it's a problem for him in the one I saw, in the intercultural collaboration I saw, using the language as sort of a way to break off from the bigger company and control how things are going.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking as we were kind of finishing the discussion of the last question, and that it needs to be acknowledged, and I'm sure everyone who's watching can see that this is an Anglophone panel. It's also an all-white panel, and I do want to acknowledge that as the person who pulled it together. This reflects who is writing about Lepage right now, in terms of these are the monographs that have recently come out there by us who are Anglophone white presenting scholars, and the voices of people from different perspectives, including from Francophone perspectives, exist. And I intend to be convening more of these panels around the publication of my book. And I'm really interested in having that, what I am sure will be a hard conversation with our Francophone colleagues about 2018. And I think it's, and I'm getting ahead of ourselves here, I think it's too simplistic to call what happened in 2018 completely divided around Francophone and Anglophone lines. It was much more complex than that. But certainly there these perspectives, the consensus that's sort of forming amongst us that the reviving the work isn't necessarily working because the cultural representations feel stale or even more outdated. That's our perspective. And in Quebec, I think he remains a really important figure, both both as an artist, but also as a cultural leader. And the sense of him being someone who at a certain point gave voice to Quebec around the world. I mean, I think there was, to a certain extent, when the Dragons trilogy wasn't fully understood around the world, that may have been part of their point, because to put a show on a stage in London at that point where there was untranslated Quebecois French was a really strong cultural statement. And that was part of what he represented to Quebec, was that he was their son who was speaking their culture around the world. And that was very, very important for that emergent national identity. The question of where he now fits in terms of like an elder statesman of Quebec culture is something I would really like to talk about again with Quebecois colleagues, about how are they seeing where he fits now, and how did they respond to the fractious events of 2018?
Can I add a sort of very personal approach, in the sense that, you know, I left and, you know, conducted my academic career in the UK. And so when Lepage would arrive, you know, as I say, I started off with my PhD in Glasgow. I kind of dragged people to see him as a, you know, this example of Canadian culture in a sense. And I think for the longest time, he really did sort of symbolize everything that was best about Quebec culture. But I think, you know, in a sense that that package, or that image left out the bits that, you know, that we know about Quebec. And I think that the 2018 you know, controversy was finally, you know, the other members of the Quebec, you know, not the pure laine perhaps, the Nouveau Québécois, who wanted to say, hang on a second, there are issues with this image. And so, you know, as you say, they needed an image internationally before it could be contested. So now it's maybe become a more complex image as a result of that, because they certainly covered the controversy in England, which again, I thought was extraordinary. You know, but it was partly because, again, of this connection with France, particularly with Slav. So again, I think it's what's really interesting from my point of view, you know, from as I say, a sort of personal point of view, is the way that he went from being this kind of, you know, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, favored uncle, to being the slightly, you know, conservative older, you know, relative who you kind of wanted to explain to people before they saw it. You know, you wanted to give some context. So I guess, yeah, I'm not sure that his statesmanship is quite what it was.
I've come in there. It's really fascinating to me that there's that you think, you know, for example, I mean, Melissa's pointed out, you know, there were no indigenous designers on the Wendake Tempest. But actually, you know, for a company that its bread and butter is touring theatre, creating a piece on that land which could never tour was just, that was, I thought, you know, I thought, okay, that's good. That's a good decision. That's not profiteering. You know, that is elements of that are, you know, intercultural. And then you come to these moments of so you think, okay, so that's good. And then there's the thing about correcting the casting, and there's a consciousness about updating the representations, changing the sort of the cliche music, for example, in you know, like the Dragons trilogy, updating it to like modern Chinese music, you know, in some like places. And then you have these, how are you getting this wrong? How are you in 2018? How are these big mistakes happening when you've acknowledged that there are problems in these areas? And it's that sort of, for me, the thing that is quite challenging is understanding the blind spots. And I think one of the things that was particularly sort of summed it up for me, that I just sort of was like, there's such a contradiction here. In speaking with Robert and speaking with other sort of collaborators, one of the things that emerged was, you know, a long-term engagement with Islamic culture, coming through working on the Spanish play, La Celestine or La Celestina. You know, meeting Arab scholars, And then in 2016, really taking, quite a bold risk, really, in sort of, building an immigration narrative out of Morocco and Algiers in the peace hearts, which never really sort of toured. But it was clear that there was an enormous amount of research going into the relationship between the West and Islamic culture, which I thought was like really interesting. And there was a character who, was experiencing sort of, all sorts of things. And then, you think, well, okay, so what's going on here? What's this saying about Quebec? And around that time, I was then, in research, I was reading about sort of like far right groups, soldiers of Odin, going out, sort of like vigilante like things, patrolling like Islamic areas or Muslim areas of Quebec City, sort of saying, we need to educate them about Canadian values. We need to keep people safe. And in his context, when he's really trying to engage with, the migration and mobility and those kinds of issues, and actually trying to sort of be intercultural in an area that perhaps people aren't, and with that as his local backdrop, you think, well, okay, maybe you are reinventing your intercultural practice, and then the next year, you get what you got. So that's the thing that I find interesting, is that how are these mistakes, because they're mistakes, by any reckoning in the 21st century, how are they still happening when that information is there?
Can I jump in and just say, I think they're bigger than mistakes. I think they're erasures of people.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that he is not doing is working with BIPOC artists in roles of agency. So he, like Ali Ndiaye was a consultant on Slav, a Black Quebecer, and, removed himself from production because he was so upset with what he saw in the preview. There was no engagement with the history of slavery in Quebec. And I think the cultural consultant or talking to scholars is one thing, but working alongside people is another thing. That's going to change, the way he works in partnership. I think when we have these hierarchies, the cultural consultant, he doesn't owe anything to them. He can pick and choose what he wants. But if it's a co-director, I think it would be different. I also think it's really important for us to acknowledge that though there aren't monographs on Lepage by BIPOC artists, there is a great compilation of literature around the 2018 problems written by BIPOC artists and scholars. And I think Russ is going to add it to the chat, but Kevin Loring, who runs the Indigenous section of the National Theatre, wrote an open letter. Ali Ndiaye wrote a piece. Philip S.S. Howard has written a piece about Slav. He's a Black scholar. It's in Theatre Research in Canada. And also Yves Sioui-Durand, who runs Odanak Theatre in Quebec, which is Quebec's only Indigenous theatre company, has written on it. So I just want to say their names, because I think that's really important, that there are voices on this, but they're not engaging in a monograph form.
And just to pick up on something that you said, that idea of having a cultural consultant, electing someone BIPOC to speak for a whole culture is part of the issue. It's sort of, that's something that's problematic in itself.
Yeah. Can I just say that that's part of the topic of the little book that I'm writing in the Shakespeare and performance elements, and looking at the way in which he has really come out of a very particular moment in Canada, which was about multiculturalism and multicultural policy. And that was very much taken apart based around tokenism. But he has continued to really do that kind of token involvement. And the productions that I wanted to, bring people back to was the very first one that he did, which was cross-cultural, which was Romeo and Juliet in Saskatoon. And again, when there was real, and tectonic plates as well, when there was real engagement with another culture, it never went well. It didn't right from the beginning. And that was also 2 directors didn't get on, or at least they tried to during the process. But then, again, the reception caused all sorts of fractures and the financial aspects as well. So again, and I guess, I'm using some of the articles that you're referring to around that controversy to say that basically my PhD was about the fact that true interculturalism is a very hard thing to do, but that both Quebec and Scotland, which were the 2 things I was comparing, with English Canada, were feeling that they were themselves under threat, and therefore found it very difficult to find empathy or a voice for smaller groups within their own communities. So, you can't be more hard done by. And so that they approach it with empathy, which is, as you say, ends up being erasure. We're just like, we understand exactly your position. Which again, nobody wants to hear.
And just something that comes up that I think I want to say about this is that the controversies that we're seeming to always be coming back to talk about were only 2 years ago, and scholarship takes a long time to come out. And so the arrival of the Theatre Research in Canada special issue this year with the articles that you mentioned by Philip Howard and Yves Suiteron and his collaborator, Catherine Chantois, that I was so glad to see that, because it's like, that was so hot in 2018. And I think for those of us who've been following Lepage as long as we have, to see these erasures, these problems become as big news as they did was quite, shocking is not the right word, because we've been asking questions about these aspects of his shows for decades, and all of a sudden it's become a mainstream news story. And so that churned. So the question of how this is going to shape the next decade of Lepage studies is something that we can't predict. But I just want to say that I think these conversations are going to continue, hopefully in dialogue across cultures, languages, generations, etc.
And I would say the other thing that, you mentioned, Karen, certainly in your book as well, is the idea of his position having changed. And this is what I'm trying to get at as well, is that, all of the solo shows talk about this great artist somewhere in the past or in, and then suddenly in his most recent show, that artist is him. And so that idea of him being able to take a position that is, without responsibility, the innocent abroad, which is pretty much the way he places himself, becomes untenable. I mean, he was seen as a young genius for, well into his 40s and even, into his 50s. So it's kind of hard for him to suddenly become the statesman from that position of being the enfant terrible for such a long time. So I think one of the problems is that a lot of things are expected of him, and it's kind of impossible for him to do all of those things simultaneously. And I would say, as you say, Jim, that and Melissa, that the Tempest showed a real desire to do things differently, but it wasn't probably something that would keep the Diamant going. I think he's also got in his mind the sense that he is actually creating. He is creating an institution, which is, bringing in new and bringing up new Quebec theatre makers. So I think that once you get a building, you get yourself into that position of being institutional, and it's very hard for you to continue to be the one who, rocks everybody else's institutional structures.
So
something.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to sort of just put it out to everyone, really, is just that basic thing of, the promise of intercultural theatre is, cultures need to understand each other. We need to live in an increasingly integrated and intermeshed world. It's got that promise of you know, of understanding. There's an optimism, almost a utopianism about it in the abstract. In reality, you know, is this just something that is just broken? Should you just say, don't bother with intercultural theatre because we've seen through it now. It's done.
But isn't
on that note, I want to plug Melissa's forthcoming article in Contemporary Theatre Review, which I think addresses some of those issues. You do have actually a kind of suggestion for a method as to how to approach something like that. If I can, though, keep our panelists on time, just to remind people, we're going to speak for about 15 more minutes, and if you have questions, please pop them into the Q&A. I'm seeing right now there are none, so we would like to have a few in there. There are some certainly interesting comments coming through in the chat, but please drop some questions in the Q&A because we'll reserve 20 minutes at the end. So I want to turn now, so this, I think we've addressed the controversy. I think everything is threading quite organically through the questions, so that's wonderful. And I guess there's that you know, Lepage, along with Guy Laliberté and Edward Locke and Louise Lecavalier, La Human Steps, there was that rock, I mean, he even did the Gabriel rock shows, right? So there was that kind of rock star Quebec on the international stage. And I guess one of the questions we had in pre-conversation was about whether this post-2018, there has been any damage to his brand in that respect. And so maybe I can wrap that into a question around criticism. And I'm interested, sort of riffing on one of Jim's questions about what does Lepage's work say about us as critics, and what we want to find in his work, and also think about this in terms of what maybe his work offers in terms of new theoretical approaches to theater, for instance, queer theory and affect theory that Karen draws upon in his work. And then the last part of I guess also to draw in Christie's approach to Lepage through Shakespeare or in dialogue with Shakespeare. I always think that Shakespeare is sustained through the critical industry on Shakespeare. And so I'm wondering the degree to which that pertains as well to Lepage. That, you know, it's quite extraordinary in Anglophone criticism alone how much has been published on his work and continues to be published on his work. And so does that draw people to his work? Does that do those lenses affect our approach? And as well, do you think Lepage pays attention? So that's a whole bunch of stuff, but essentially thinking about Lepage through the criticism on his work.
I'll start out on that one. One thing, methodology has been very much on my mind because I had to talk about what it was in my book. And we've established that all of us who are on the panel have been in the room and watched him work. And that was part of our methodology, was actually going and observing and doing, and that talking about process as well as the shows that appear on the stage. And that this is something that Ex Machina very much welcomes. Like there is a job, like there's a position called observer that you can apply for. And I mean, this is a very different kind of approach to, say, journalistic theater criticism as traditionally wrought, where there's a thing on the stage and you talk about it. And it's the production that makes the meaning. And the methodologies that I know that I undertook were both to observe the work, but also to take what he said as part of the evidence, which isn't necessarily to say to believe it as truth, but his claims about the work, I think, are centrally important to the meanings of the work. And I think that this is a very particular kind of theater scholarship that we're doing because the person is alive. And so we can go watch him work and we can perhaps personally ask him questions. And I have found that a very positive and stimulating way of working, but also I find a very slippery slope one, because he's very convincing and he's very charismatic and he's an exciting person in whose presence to be. And so how to how to take on board what he says. And why shouldn't we take on board what he says? He's the artist, for God's sake, but then not to fall into his thrall, frankly. And so this to me puts me in the space of the difficult conversation, which is a space where I think we find ourselves a lot in Anglophone Western culture these days. Does Lepage pay attention? I have no idea. How would he respond to the things that we're saying about him right now? What would that conversation look like? It's a little bit weird that we're all sitting here and talking about him and he's not part of that conversation, I think. And I just feel like I need to say that, like, he's fascinating, he's important, he's powerful, we're talking about him. His work is a dialogue, we respond to it, but then where's his response coming back?
I come in there.
Yeah.
I just finished reading your chapter on Fancy, and I love the fact that you suggest that his initial impulse was to get us to help him rewrite himself, if you see what, in that sense. So we were kind of a mirror to him in the same way that he was a mirror to us. And I think one of the things that I have suggested in the past is that he did make an enormous, had an enormous impact on particularly critics in Britain, I think, in terms of accepting a process, accepting that something that wasn't finished. And betting on or against him, because a lot of people did that at the beginning, going, this isn't anything, because they saw, finished products, as it were, to begin with. And then when things came that were not quite finished or were in the process of being finished, people, the critics really kind of went, oh, I told you so. He's not as great as you thought. Or they were on the other side going, wait a minute, hang on, well, let's wait and see. And that kind of engagement in a dialogue with the creative process is something that I hadn't seen before. And so I think that that's a huge thing that he did. But again, I think that it forced the critics to see themselves in a new way. And I think he's done that for all of us. And so we kind of want to have him reflect back, to us. But that's not really, despite there is a kind of illusion, as you say, a charismatic illusion in that dialogue, the notion of being that it's going to come back to us. In a sense, I guess what I did was take that methodology and move on and did I did a book on the first 10 years at Shakespeare's Globe. And again, that idea of being the critical friend, it's not a happy place to be. And, I certainly know people who've written on that subject, is that, you're seen as one of them, but then you're not one of them. And then, I have this very vivid image of taking notes, when I was watching all of the rehearsals for Macbeth and the Toronto Drama Center. And I was absorbed in my note taking. And suddenly there was this, shadow over my head, and he was looking over to try to read what I was doing, over the top of my book. And I just I found myself closing it up. And I thought, that's not really fair, is it? Because he's opened himself up to me. But has he? I was just rereading the notes that I took at the time. I ended up, walking lights for them and doing all sorts of things. So you're made to feel part of that process, so that you will, report on it in a positive way. So yeah, it forces you to rethink your position as a critic. And I think that's a blessing in some ways, but I don't necessarily expect him to care that he's made me go through this process.
He did say in interview that he does read his reviews and that he will make changes if he thinks that the reviewer has made a good point. There's two things, and I think maybe Melissa is better positioned to speak about what I'm going to say. So just cut me off if I'm speaking rubbish. But there are critical environments, and one of the most hostile ones in the world. Certainly, it used to be that a New York reviewer could close down a show with a bad review. Is New York, and what's really interesting is he came out sort of to defend The Ring in response to the criticism that he had there. And I do think Karen is right. He can put you off your game. You can find yourself, I've accepted something that he said without sort of doing my job, as it were, because it just seems so oh, okay, that's how it is. But it's those moments of tension particularly around the ring, where you see something, you know, a project that's obviously really close to his heart, a huge project, you know, a world famous production, you know, that was getting on television. Theatre doesn't really get on television. It doesn't, you know, it just doesn't, it's not the conversation, you know, it's not The Sopranos. But there was this production, and I think it's really interesting is that, you know, he will have that informal relationship, and he will have observers, and then he'll have these tense relationships. But I think probably his most troubled relationship with criticism is at home, in the Quebec critics, you know, because some of them have said, you know, what you do isn't theatre because it's not text. And you know, he's been hurt, really hurt artistically, and stopped practicing as an actor because of hostile reviews. And I think one of the things that you've got to say is, you know, the reviewer is secondary to the artist. You know, what we do depends on other people, you know, putting their names out there and making, you know, maybe mistakes or getting it right or whatever. What are we doing when we then, you know, respond in a way that, you know, is hostile to an artist or damaging or not understanding what they're doing? But the problem with Lepage is it's so difficult to understand what he's doing because, you know, a show might roll into town like every 2 years, and in that intervening 2 years, there will be 2 other shows that you won't have seen, which will inform the trajectory of the development of the work. And what I found with, you know, trying to, you know, clean out that whole problem of what is the sort of the trajectory, the through line, is it's so organic. It makes a real problem for criticism, I think.
Well, I was just going to say about the ring, a few things. Building on what Christie said, we were in a specific area, the observers, and I guess it depends on the size of the project, how many there are. There were like 4 of us, and, you know, we all remained best buddies. But I remember one day after rehearsal, it was weeks and weeks in, he just saunters up and goes, "So what do you think?" And it was the ring. And we all took a pause and sort of, you know, said really nice things. But again, we were in a situation where, I mean, to tell the truth, I don't think we'd still be in the room if we had done it. But what I'm more interested in is how he's received in the US. I was looking back at reviews of the revival of The Ring in 2019. And one of the reviews in the New York Times sort of says, well, yeah, now it's good, but it's boring. So there's this real tendency to, you know, if things aren't polished, they're not familiar with his work in process way of presenting. So it sort of said, well, now, you know, now it's acceptable, but it's completely apolitical, his ring, which I do think is an interesting thing to think about. There really isn't, you know, Cherot's ring challenged the bourgeoisie and the 1%, and Lepage's ring was very literal. It didn't sort of present big challenges or look at issues of the time. And while we were in rehearsal, Occupy was raging down the street.
Yeah, a couple things. I'm going to pick up on a great quote that Mark Fisher offered us in the chat. Thank you, Mark. Hello, Edinburgh. And I want to, something that's been ringing in my mind is about how he was received in Quebec, as Jim was referring to, and a critic with whom he had a very intense, who reviewed his work very, very intently in the early days was Lepage. And he said, and I quote this in the first chapter of my book, that as Lepage was like ascending, Robert Lepage was like, it's so amazing, it's so beautiful, it blows us away, but what is this man trying to say? Like, he's like an air traffic controller You know, like where is this coming into land? Like he's manipulating us all from the skies, but what is this all about? And I find that an interesting connection to your point, Melissa, about saying, what was his ring about? And I think this is part of the concern, right? Is that he tried for a long time to make work that wasn't about socio-political issues. And that is part of what made it work around the world. Or Dragon's Trilogy was profoundly about socio-political issues in Quebec that were not necessarily legible around the world, but it had all kinds of other things going for it that people really fell for. So and what Mark is bringing up is something that Robert said to Mark in a 2015 interview, which is that Robert represents the globalization of his career is very strategic. If he gets killed by the critics in New York, well, he's going to be in Amsterdam next week. So this is my thing about he's within systems, but he's trying to be with outside systems. Keeping moving all the time means you can't be killed by the critics in any one location, but then it raises the question of who you're responsible to and what you're actually talking about.
I'm sorry, Jim.
Please. I just want to say one very, very simple thing. Karen's just got something in a nutshell there, which is that Robert's energy is about expanding, you know, but that forward, you know, movement all the time, it's what's being left behind.
Yeah. So maybe we can take this, just coming up to time for questions. The always moving metaphor, we're in lockdown, sheltering in place, and they're doing the same thing at the Diamant. Karen, you have some information about what they're up to there, but I'm wondering if we can fold that into a last comment, and I'll ask you to be succinct if you can, about, so if Karen, you would like to go first, you could then update us a little bit about the information you received. And then if each of you could sort of maybe think about where you'd like to see Lepage and Ex Machina go post-pandemic. I know that's a kind of big question that brings all kinds of larger ideological and cultural and health-related issues into it. But, you know, in this moment of pause, where presumably he and the company are reflecting on what to do next, what would surprise you? What would you welcome? Yeah, maybe we can go out on that note.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, in preparation for this panel, Melissa and I were chatting, and we were kind of saying, what are they up to? And we said, well, we could ask them. So I got in touch with the director of Le Diamant, which is the venue, Bernard Gilbert, and I got in touch with the producer of Ex Machina, Michel Bernatchez, and basically said, what are you up to? And very strongly and very clearly from both organizations, they are not interested in the digital pivot. It's not about recrafting what they do to make Zoom plays. It's about trying to figure out how to continue to make live performance, because that's something that was articulated as a major commitment, and then how to do that under the conditions of social distancing and that sort of thing. The tantalizing prospect has been presented that Robert is working on a new solo that they hope will see the light of day by the end of 2021. And that strikes me as very interesting, given that his work is very autobiographical, and 887 took us up to a certain point, and one wonders if 2018 and all that it was is going to be in that somehow. And they're also working on trying to figure out how to make some of his smaller shows be done live. So, and this I think is super interesting, that they're working on a revival of Far Side of the Moon, the stage play, but with two actors playing the brothers, Robert and Yves Jacques, who has been the other actor who's played it. So I think Lepage Geeks around I'm super pumped to see that. And I have some thoughts about what I'd like to see going forward, but I'll leave the floor to folks first.
Anybody want to weigh in really quickly? We do have one question in the chat or in the Q&A.
I'd just say that I think that the pandemic and it really shows that he is committed to live theater, but not to the 21st century in terms of the communication technology. The thing that I was so excited about when, with the early productions, and Zulu time and all of those sorts of things, that there was such an engagement with how difficult it was to communicate, particularly emotion, through technology. And what was interesting to me is that and why those older shows have continued, I think, is because he's trying to have relationships on the phone, or there are all these, and the isolation that he felt, and the difficulty in communicating across language and across time zones and all the rest of it, is something that was kind of unique to artists traveling at the time. And now it's what we all experience all the time. So I'd really like to see him engage with, social media, some of the things that he has experienced, like you say, he's been attacked, he's been hurt. It'd be really interesting to see him turn that into theater, and to give, I think what he's really helped people talk about, and he gets some pretty terrible review headlines in Britain about being a creator of soap operas and all the rest of it, is that again, I hate to say it's a bit Shakespearean, the absolutely pedestrian alongside the absolutely sort of ethereal, and it's that clash of the two things coming together. And I'd like to see that again, please. No small order there.
Jim or Melissa?
Well, I would just like to say my biggest hope comes from Kevin Loring's letter to Lepage after Canada. He says, "Nothing about us without us." And I really hope that Lepage, when he shouldn't be telling other people's stories. And if he wants to tell stories that he doesn't know, I really hope that he does it in collaboration with those artists. I think he'll learn a lot. And I think he has a great platform to share with other artists.
Yeah, well said. I think there's two ways to go. One of the things in my book project was I spoke to Michel Bonacci about the experience of touring, and he said that after about 15 years they sat down with a map of the world and put pins in where they'd been, because they thought they'd covered like the globe, but really it wasn't. They weren't surprising themselves. They weren't really going to certain places. And of course, economics is a huge factor in that. And I think, theatre is sometimes it's a very wealthy art form, and other times it isn't. But the amount of resources and time to really have, artists meeting each other and making theatre together would require a major, major investment from governments. And I think that would be something that they could do in the future. But at the same time, as Melissa says, there's that nothing about us without us. Maybe they're not best positioned. So maybe the way they should go is to actually say, we're going home. And this thing that I sense that Robert continually learning about his own voice and what he needs to say as an artist, is still producing interesting work. And now they've got the base in Quebec. It's much more about, rather than spreading out thin across the whole world, it's about drilling down deep and finding out what Quebec is, who they are, what they need to say to the world. So I definitely think they're at a watershed moment as a company because of 2018. And the fact that 887 was around at the same time, you've got this pinnacle and this trough. What do you do? So, it's a big moment.
One final thing that I'd like to say about this piece about going forward, and really kind of bouncing off of what Christie was saying, is at first when I heard from Ex Machina and Le Diamant that they're like no to the digital, I was like, but that's what you do. But then I'm like, but no, it's not, because I devote several chapters in my book to talking about the whole notion of his dramaturgy being cinematic, which is something that we've all said, that everybody says, that we all know it evokes cinema, but how does that actually work, right? So the work is about transposing the language of cinema, techniques like montage, onto the stage, and seeing about how they work on stage as theatrical language, speaking to audiences in the language of the 20th century, which was the language of cinema. That's not the language of the 21st century, it's different. And is Robert Lepage and Ex Machina ready to actually to figure out what the language of the digital is and do that either in the digital or on stage. It's not the same thing as cinematic dramaturgy. And I guess I was talking to a friend of mine who's been working in the world of Lepage for almost as long as he has. And she said to me, I'm not sure if I'm ready for another reinvention. So that, you know, is he going to take that challenge of figuring out how to make theater speak from in the formal language of today? Got a big question about that. And I also think that the questions that are being asked about responsibility, collaboration, drilling down deep into the complexity of Quebec are also super, super exciting and provocative suggestions and ideas.
Can I add to that, or we've got to go into the questions?
Well, we do have 10 minutes only left, so maybe we should go to the questions, if that's all right. We have one so far, so we might be able to return to some of these ideas. This is from Mark Fisher. Do you think someone whose grounding was in improvisation has created a form of theater that is similarly written on the wind? It seems to mean something in the moment, but it can be hard to pin down. So I think that's come up, but does anybody want to also address that? And I mean, I think that Jim talks about a little bit about that moment, you know, the theater repair phase and the RSVP cycles, and then the, oh, I'm not doing that anymore. So there's also that kind of idea of improvisation in the approach to the making. And I guess that's partly what you're addressing. Is he ready, Karen and Christie, to embrace that in our current sort of digital moment? But does anybody want to take that question on?
Well, Karen, oh, go ahead, Jim.
No, you, off you.
When Karen supervised my PhD, and one of the things we were talking about was Lepage starting to circulate scripts of his work, and when that happened, and Karen had the, you know, insane experience of writing, you know, transcribing 7 Streams of the River Ota. And is there a Blue Dragon script? Because I know there's I have the graphic novel sort of version of it, which is amazing. But there seems like there's been a little bit of an increase, like there's the Anderson project. And is that economically driven? That's my question to you guys with these scripts that, and it even if you read it, that's not necessarily what you're going to see.
I think it's part of legacy building, and I think it is this idea of the Robert Lepage Industries being a conglomeration of industries that also, at the current moment, seems to de facto involve a publishing arm, even though they don't publish, but they have, and Fair Play, like, mostly work with Quebec City-based publishers. But I think a lot of these projects seem to be really part of Robert's imagination, that why not make a graphic novel out of Blue Dragon since it was inspired by Tintin? Like, totally cool idea. And it's another toy. I mean, I think it's another aspect of the playfulness, I think. But to come back to the moment that you're articulating, Melissa, I think that's a really good way to connect with Mark's question, which was early on, they wouldn't publish the work because they couldn't, because it wasn't written down. And they were a young company, and they were traveling around the world, and it was changing a lot in response to audience and critical. So it wasn't written down. And then at a certain crux point, it was quite surprising to those of us who had chased the scripts as scholars. We got to have something to talk about. All of a sudden they're publishing them when it was almost an ideological thing. We don't publish our work. And I think that, to me, the changeover has to do with creating an industry. It has to do with legacy. That's what I have to say about that.
I kind of, I still think improvisation is, you know, it's kind of strange because improvisation has sort of become more important at the same time as writing has become more important. So you know, 887, you know, they did a month long of afternoon rehearsals with Robert and Steve Blanchett, the sort of the creative director. And at the end of that, they did the public showing, but it was only for members of Ex Machina. They didn't do the public showing with the public because it was too private. But that showing was 2 hours of improvisation, which was created in a month, and there were 40 scenes. And Robert, as my understanding is, it was never written down. It was retained in his mind, and he just gave it as a performance. And there wasn't a person there that said, "Don't make it as a show." And I think one of the things with improvisation is that Robert has quite a terrifyingly good memory. And he's actually scared me by quoting me from an interview 3 years previously, with no contact in between, and catching me out on you know, having a different sort of like take on something. I just couldn't believe it. So this thing with memory in 887, I think, is a hinge moment, because of course that is written down and it's published as a script, and it kind of works as a play. It works like a play text. I'm not sure you could sort of do it unless you were Robert. But then with the collaborations, you know, in the rehearsal room, watching someone do, you know, Catherine Hunter doing an improvisation that was 45 minutes long. And it was like watching a play being written on the wing, and then doing it again after notes, bringing it down to 15 minutes, and then bringing it down to 5. And then that night writing that down. I think language is language and memory, because Robert has this ability to do this. He expects it from other people to be able to mobilize language in the most you know, compress it, expand it. I think it's to do with his facility for language. That's where the ephemeral quality comes in, and he loves all aspects of it, whether it's banal or, you know, poetic.
Can I just?
Yeah, go ahead, Christie. Yeah, please.
And sorry, I dropped out there for a minute. I don't know what happened. I was just going to say that's why I'm sort of re-engaging with all of this, because his relationship with Shakespeare, you know, which is text, and is really interesting. And you know how the improvisational approach doesn't necessarily work with classically trained actors, is another thing he's found. But what I thought was interesting is that, you know, we've talked a lot about 2018, but the Coriolanus that was happening in Stratford, Ontario at the same time was really, again, eye-opening. I think possibly to Lepage, because there was the audience that he wanted, actually, who were incredibly familiar both with theater and Shakespeare and cinema. And so the audiences were totally engaged in the theater. But then, of course, it was then made into a film version of it, which was shown in cinemas, and then it was broadcast live. You know, and again, I had the opportunity to review it, but, you know, having seen it live in 2018 and then on my screen, you know, in the UK, it was a very different experience. But in a strange way, there was something that actually worked in terms of the actors who knew that text inside out, upside down, and backwards, and knew each other, but then were, you know, they were sort of dropped into his older vision of the play. But it worked extremely well, I thought, in bringing those things together, and it was a collaboration in a way that I hadn't seen before. And the interviews that accompanied the live broadcast were very interesting. And he said himself on that occasion, we have to start over. You know, the theater of the former period is done. We just have to start over.
We do have a couple of other questions, but I was just thinking that on the subject of chasing the text, you know, I was thinking about that in relation to Shakespeare and the various folio and quarto editions. We have to find the bad quarto of 7 streams. So from Helen Meany, taking up Karen's point about this critical discussion about Lepage's work taking place without him, would you consider inviting him to participate directly in a future discussion? And in fact, we had talked about the way in which he might be actually lurking on this call, and Bama said a certain point. But I mean, Karen, is that actually something you would be open to in terms of your own publicity around the book?
Oh gosh, absolutely. I just don't, framing that discussion would be so challenging, right? Like, what would you hive off? And what, I mean, it's a very provocative idea. I'd love to, but I don't, what setting would he agree to, right? And what would the occasion be? If they were reopening Le Diamant triumphantly with actual people breathing the same space together, that would be a joyous occasion to meet, perhaps. Yeah, I'd be super open to that, but I think I have to believe that he chooses his moments of engagement very carefully.
Yeah, I have to say on that note, he twice here in Vancouver, we've had him at the School for Contemporary Arts give sort of an open talk, once to students and once to the general public, which was quite wonderful and quite generous. But there were a lot of mechanics around getting that to happen.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna close with Stephanie Nutting's question, which is addressed to Karen, but I would suggest maybe it would be great ending for all of you to pick a touchstone production. She asks, which productions would you flag as the highlights of his career so far? And that's probably like choosing a favorite child, but we can maybe think about that across again, the entire oeuvre. And
mine's very quick, so I'm going to go first. And I'd say the first and the last. Vinci was the first one, and it blew me away. And Coriolanus is the most complex one, because I think it does sort of really challenge him as a director, as well as the institution that he's engaged with. That's me.
Mine is, I would say, Moulin à Images, the projected show that was on the grain silos in Quebec, the Image Mill. And I think that would be a wonderful gift to bring back to people while they're in pandemic lockdown. Just love that show.
For me, there's two productions. One would be The Far Side of the Moon, because it's the first one that I saw, but also because of the sheer affect of that piece of theatre. That would just reminded everybody that theatre is, at its core, a feeling form. It's about feeling. That's its power. All of its political effects come from feeling it, and I just think that was a world beater. And the other one is Hearts, the second part of the playing cards sort of quartet. And the reason for that is they just took such a risk with trying to actually reinvent the theatre space itself, compressing the wings under the stage, audience in the round, which isn't that spectacular, but having all of the projection stuff being hung, the whole thing being a unit above, trying to do that in 360 degree venues around the world, very few of which had ceilings to support that kind of weight. Such an absolute far out kind of project. But that particular piece, More Than Spades, was just bringing together so much stuff for me. And I was really sad that it didn't get to tour.
Mine would be Vinci was the one that got away. I never saw it, but it's probably the production of Lepage's that I've obsessed about the most and rewritten that chapter many, many times. So I'm delighted that you read it, Christie. I hope other people do. I think for me, it's my first time. It was Tectonic Plates and Robert Lepage's indelible performance as Jennifer McMahon, wearing a dress. One of his most beautiful creations and occasions for the kind of, is my introduction to him as an actor and in his subtlety as an actor. And I would like to bring this around in thanks to our amazing chair and finish by asking you, Peter, what's your favorite Lepage?
That's a good question. I would say La Face Cachée de la Lune is up there for sure. And it's my favorite film of his as well. And then I saw Needles and Opium with, what's the actor's name who replaced him?
Marc Labrèche.
Yeah, Marc Labrèche at the Cultch. And I loved it because of the intimacy of it being in this particular venue in Vancouver. So I definitely lean more to the solo shows. just partly because I haven't seen enough of the ensemble work, although I did see the film version of Tectonic Plates. Yeah.
And if, Peter, the way that you write about the final image of the film version of Far Side of the Moon is incredibly beautiful, and I encourage everyone to read it.
As moderator, I have the unfortunate, duty of bringing things to a close. I would love for us to go on, but I do have another engagement to get to. I can't do the math. I don't know what time it is where you are, Jim, but I know it's late. And to Melissa and Christie, Jim, Karen, to Russ, our wonderful research assistant and assistant technician, thank you so much. Do you want to do some plugging of upcoming events, Karen, before we break off?
Yes, if I could remember the date. I am speaking in Royal Central School of Speech and Drama's Research at series in late January, and that's me on my own and then in conversation. So I'll put that out in social media. But thank you all so much for being here. It's so great to be Lepage geeking out with all of you who are so interested and so deeply engaged in the work.
Okay.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you all.
Thanks all.
Thank you for organizing.
Guys, thanks,
Bye.
Melissa.
Thanks.